Hi, welcome to the short screencast for our strengthening lecture. This week we'll go over the principles of therapeutic strengthening. As I mentioned last week, having these short 10-minute voiceovers allows me much more time for discussion and demonstration, so please feel free to watch this at any point in time that you need, and thank you again for spending a little bit of preparation time in this course. So objectives for the week. First of all, we're going to understand several different types of therapeutic strengthening approaches and exercises, and then look at the indications or when we would use each one of those approaches or exercise. I want you to understand the precautions and contraindications for the application of resistance exercises, as well as apply current evidence and principles to real-world situations to ultimately be able to effectively design, communicate, and apply these therapeutic strengthening principles to your patients. So when do we think about using therapeutic strengthening? And there's a few items listed here. So a patient who has impaired muscle performance, that might be strength, it might be decreased power, and they might have decreased endurance. Patient may need to improve the capacity of the body to repair itself due to the positive effects of remodeling. So you've learned this in a few classes already, where if we stress the body will respond. So taking something like an Achilles repair and never, ever, ever stressing that Achilles tendon will not help it to repair or to heal or to remodel. So ultimately, by stressing that tissue, we may increase its capacity for the body to heal it. Those patients that have a high risk of injury, like doing certain strengthening exercises, we can help to reduce injury. Patients with poor balance, balance is an element of balance is a required amount of strength. So doing some strengthening exercises can help to improve balance. Patients with poor bone mineral density or potentially osteoporotic patients, the more stress that can be placed on the bones, the potential to decrease the loss of bone mineral density can occur through strengthening exercise. And ultimately, as we mentioned in the very first lecture, those people with impaired functional performance, disability, or quality of life, strengthening exercises offer significant potential for those patients to improve that functional performance. So a few definitions. So what is strength, or what is muscle strength? So muscle strength is a broad term that refers to the ability of contractile tissue to produce tension and the resultant force based on the demands placed on a muscle. It's the greatest measurable force that can be exerted by a muscle or a muscle group. However, perhaps sometimes more importantly in the physio world is functional strength. And Kisner and Colby define that as the ability of the neuromuscular system to produce, reduce, or control forces contemplated or imposed on during functional activities in a smooth and coordinated manner. Okay, so ultimately my interpretation of that is, can your patient do what they need to do or what they want to do? Are they strong enough to lift a coffee cup into the cupboard, or are they strong enough to get off of the toilet? So strength training or strength exercises are defined as a systematic procedure of a muscle or muscle group lifting, lowering, or controlling heavy loads. So they're forcing through resistance for a relatively low number of repetitions or over a short period of time. The most common adaptation is an increase in the muscle strength as a result of neural adaptations and an increase in the muscle fiber size. Both of those ultimately lead to an increase in strength. Power. So power is defined as the rate of performing work. So strength and speed of doing a particular movement or activity. It can be a single burst of high intensity activity. So that can be something like lifting a heavy piece of luggage up into the trunk of your car. Or it could be a repeated burst of low intensity activity, climbing stairs. So just right now, how many of you thought of when we say a single burst of high intensity activity, we're thinking more of like a plyometric or leaping up onto a box? And you wouldn't have thought of something like lifting up a piece of luggage that way. But it is important when you start to think that the vast majority of the patients that we're seeing will be considering some of these more functional type of tasks. So power training then, basically, as I mentioned, our lives require explosive bursts of strength and speed daily or on a regular basis. So we are then trying to challenge our patients by increasing the amount of strength or the amount of work that the patient will be completing, and potentially decreasing the amount of time that it takes to do that. So that could be something like a plyometric, like I said before, we have something like kind of trying to leap up onto something, or something very simple like brushing your teeth. there's an element of speed that's required or amount of strength that's required to brush your teeth. So if a patient has limited strength and ability to generate power, the act of brushing their teeth is going to be very, very ineffective. So endurance is defined as the ability to perform low-intensity, repetitive, or sustained activities over a prolonged period of time. Okay, so typically endurance we think less intense, but it's over a prolonged period of time or an amount of time. So muscle endurance is defined as the ability of a muscle to contract repeatedly against the load, to generate and sustain tension, and resist fatigue over an extended period of time. And that resist fatigue is very, very important when we think about endurance. However, for good and for bad, strength and endurance often do not always correlate well together. So muscles or groups of muscles that tend to be strong potentially have low endurance capacity, or some people may have a good endurance capacity but limited amounts of strength. So ultimately then, with endurance training, it is characterized by having a muscle contract and lift or lower a load for many repetitions, or to sustain a muscle contraction for an extended period of time. So you think about yourself sitting here in good posture position, or just sitting in any position or standing. That element of your postural muscles holding you up and preventing you from collapsing down due to gravity is an endurance training or endurance type of exercise. Endurance training will often involve low intensity contractions with a large number of them occurring over a prolonged period of time. Those muscles are able to adapt to endurance training by increasing their oxidative and metabolic capacities, and endurance training exercises may have a more positive impact on function than strength training alone. Okay, and I know that that can be taken with a grain of salt, but truly, there are certain functional cases where definitely we have to look at improving strength, but we also have to focus on endurance with regards to our patients that we are seeing. So another key component is thinking about retraining or learning versus strengthening. I can't tell you how often and how much time I've spent working with patients where the focus on us before we can even get to strengthening has to be on retraining or relearning. Okay, so the example is Johnny might be able to raise his shoulder up to 90 degrees and have what you will consider a 5 out of 5 strength when he does it, but he may not do it well. He may have something, for example, poor scapular control. So as an example, when we switch to this video here, so this patient's able to raise their arms all the way up, so they have functional range of motion, but they have absolutely terrible scapular mechanics. So in this particular patient, if I'm just focused on whether he can do it or not, he can, but we need to work at retraining and relearning how he moves his scapula. However, for some patients, that may not always be possible. We may need to look at how we get our patients just to functionally achieve a certain task or goal.
So much good has come out of it.
So obviously, with that particular patient, there are ways that we may look at technique or we may look at form and try to improve that. But ultimately for her, we aren't necessarily going to be as focused on her scapular stability or scapular rhythm as much as we may be focused on her ability to lift that bar above her head. Okay, so basically this is just to kind of show you a contrast where retraining and relearning is often something that we spend a lot of time with our patients, but depending on the patient's impairments or disability or capabilities, we may have to sometimes just truly go towards a functional approach rather than a proper or a technically perfect approach. So a few key principles just to finish off the lecture, and these basically kind of set the stage for some of the determinants of the exercises, or in determining the exercises with regards to strengthening for our patients. This is the 5th time you've heard this now, the SAID principles, so the specific adaptation to impose demand. Basically, our body systems adapt to the stresses on them. I took a really neat course where basically they said that weakness is a disease, and basically weakness in general is destroying our bodies and causing many of the orthopedic problems that we are seeing in our population and in our patients. So ultimately we need to strengthen or challenge the muscles in our bodies to try to improve their strength, but also their functional capacity. Another key principle is specificity of training. So the adaptive effects of training, such as gain in strength, power, and endurance, are specific to the type of training. And what that means is, if you just, as an example, work on knee extensions. So you go to the gym and you have someone put a 10-pound weight on their knee, and they just are sitting on a chair and they're pushing out, trying to extend their knee. That will help them to strengthen their knee extension. But that may not help them with a task for their quads, as an example, to get off the toilet. Okay? And so basically what that means is you want to incorporate functional exercises whenever possible. So if your goal is to strengthen the quads or strengthen the knee to try to improve transfers, you're much better off to do it in a functional weight-bearing position or posture rather than trying to do in a non-weight-bearing extension type of exercise. However, I do realize that that's not always possible for reasons like balance or weight-bearing status or whatever, but basically you want to be as specific as possible with regards to training based on the goals that you have. And then that feeds into the next part of transfer of training. And what that means is there's cross-training or overflow. And so ultimately that means you may get some improvements in other factors, but not as much as being specific. So going back to that last example, potentially your patient who's done some knee extension exercises in an open kinetic chain or in a seated position has the potential to strengthen up that it may aid in their ability to transfer. Okay, so if you can get very specific into gym type tasks, but basically what I'm getting at is if you strengthen a muscle group in a certain way, it has the potential to help strengthen the muscle group in another functional or a different type of activity. The last principle, very straightforward principle, is the reversibility principle. Basically it means gains are transient unless they're maintained, or ultimately you use it or you lose it. So anyone who's gone to the gym before knows that when they get in a good cycle, they've been going at it for 6, 8, 10 months, they start to get stronger, they start to notice that their ability to, for example, bench press or something like that will increase, but you stop going to the gym, you're going to lose some of that strength. And from a functional perspective, that patient who has had no trouble living independently is doing just fine. They have a mild cardiac issue, or they end up sick, they end up in the hospital with an infection, and over the course of the next couple of weeks, they are unable to transfer independently. They struggle to go up a flight of stairs. Obviously, there's cardiovascular factors in there, but ultimately, they have lost some of their muscle strength and their ability. And so, I mean, it doesn't mean that that's a permanent loss. They just have to get back into doing either a strengthening program or functional daily tasks to try to get that strength back. Okay, we will continue on from here with lecture on Tuesday.